Episode 5. What is different is dangerous. Why some cultures fear the unknown and others find it exciting. November 2016. If you were alive and paying attention, you remember where you were. I was in Germany teaching English, and the morning after Donald Trump was elected to his first term as President of the United States, I walked into a classroom full of German students who had questions I was not entirely prepared to answer. What unfolded over the following weeks taught me more about German culture than 3 years of living there had managed to. Because the fears my students expressed, specific, visceral, deeply felt, turned out to have very little to do with Donald Trump, and everything to do with something much older and deeper, the way certain cultures relate to uncertainty itself. As someone educated in the United States who speaks American English and spent years absorbing American culture from the inside, I felt a certain responsibility in those conversations. The German media at the time was overwhelmingly critical of the new president, and often, in my view, imprecise. So I saw my role as a cultural translator, not defending or attacking any political position, but offering context my students simply didn't have access to. One recurring confusion was structural. My students struggled to understand how a candidate could win an election while losing the popular vote. I found myself explaining the Electoral College, how American presidential elections function less like a single national vote and more like a tournament, state by state, each with its own rules and weight. A system designed by people deeply skeptical of simple majority rule, which has produced surprising results ever since. My students found this baffling. In Germany, as in most European democracies, the rules are more direct. The idea that the person with the most votes might not win felt, to them, like a system designed to produce instability, like a game where the rules could betray you at any moment. As the conversations continued across different classes, a pattern emerged that I found genuinely striking. Beyond their anxieties about the new president himself, my students raised three specific concerns again and again: gun violence, job instability, and the absence of universal health care. Now, these are real issues, but here's what caught my attention. None of these three things had been caused by Donald Trump. Gun violence had been part of American life for decades. The precariousness of employment predated his presidency by generations, and the American approach to healthcare had been a political battleground for most of the 20th century. So why were my students attaching these concerns so specifically to this particular moment? Why did the election of one unpredictable figure seem to crystallize for them every systemic uncertainty in American life? At the time, I didn't have a clean answer, but I filed the question away, and a few years later, I found it. In 2019, I received a job offer that required me to relocate from Hamburg to Berlin. I was excited. It was a good opportunity, a new city, a new chapter. The reactions of the people around me were instructive. Several of my students, most of them between 45 and 55, were visibly perplexed. Not by Berlin, not by the job itself, by the fact that I had been looking for other work while already employed. It was instability. In their framework, this was not ambition. Why would you be looking for another one? You had a job. They suggested I commute between Hamburg and Berlin, roughly 2.5 hours each way, until I had secured housing in Berlin. Others went further. Simply moving before having a place confirmed struck them as reckless. One student told me, almost admiringly, that decades earlier he had commuted 6 hours daily rather than uproot his family from their home. He mentioned that a Japanese student had said similar arrangements were quite normal in Japan. I remember sitting with that for a moment. 6 hours a day, every day, for years. Not because there was no alternative, but because the alternative involved change. And change, in this cultural framework, carried a weight that routine, however exhausting, did not. In my new role in Berlin, I regularly encountered students from other parts of the world who had arrived in Germany without secured housing, counting on people they would meet or simply trusting that things would work out. To my German colleagues, this was almost incomprehensible. To the students themselves, it was simply how life worked. In many parts of the world, you live for the moment. Tomorrow is not guaranteed. Planning too far ahead can feel not just unnecessary, but almost presumptuous. Two entirely rational responses to the same human condition, an uncertain future. One culture builds walls against it. Another learns to move within it. Germany scores relatively high on uncertainty avoidance. And once you understand that, so much of what I witnessed begins to make sense. The students who couldn't understand why I was job hunting while employed weren't being small-minded. They were operating from a framework in which stability is not just preferable, it is the baseline expectation of a well-ordered life. To voluntarily introduce instability, even in pursuit of something better, triggers a kind of cultural alarm. Those who suggested I commute 6 hours a day weren't being impractical. They were offering what felt to them like the obviously sensible solution: maintain what is known, defer the unknown for as long as possible. As for my students in 2016, who linked Trump's election to guns, healthcare, and job insecurity, they weren't being irrational. They were responding to what his unpredictability represented in their cultural imagination, a system that had abandoned the guardrails, a country that had chosen chaos over order. For a high uncertainty avoidance culture, that is not just politically concerning, it is existentially unsettling. For low uncertainty avoidance societies, what is different is interesting. For high uncertainty avoidance ones, what is different is dangerous. Read that twice, because it doesn't just explain my German students' reaction to an American election. It explains the 6 hour commute. It explains the insistence on secured housing before any move. It explains why a man changing jobs voluntarily looks, to some eyes, not like ambition, but like recklessness. And it explains something much larger too, something we will return to in future episodes: the political instincts of entire nations, the appetite for immigration or the resistance to it, the willingness to experiment with new social policies, or the deep conservatism that keeps proven systems in place long after they stop working perfectly. All of it rooted in how comfortable a culture is with not knowing what comes next. I did move to Berlin without waiting, without commuting 6 hours a day. I found housing. Things worked out, imperfectly, as things usually do, but they worked out. And I don't tell that story to suggest that the German way is wrong or that my way was braver. What I learned, living inside a high uncertainty avoidance culture for several years, is that there is a genuine comfort in order, a real dignity in the rituals and structures that high uncertainty avoidance cultures have built. They persist not just out of habit, but because they work, because they provide something that low uncertainty avoidance cultures often struggle to offer: the feeling that tomorrow will look like today. Whether that feeling is worth the price of never finding out what else tomorrow might have been, that is a question each culture answers differently. Not to judge, to understand. Next time we leave the classroom and step onto the dojo mat. Over 20 years of martial arts across different disciplines have given me a front row seat to one of the most vivid cultural collisions in fighting sports: the gi versus the no-gi dynamics. Power distance, individualism, and high and low context, all fought out on a training mat. See you then.